My granddaughter Olivia, the apple of my eye, the child I'd bounced on my knee and sung lullabies to until my throat was hoarse, called me embarrassing. Not in a fit of teenage angst, not in a careless whisper meant for other ears, but directly, coolly, her lovely young face, the one I still saw as a cherubic toddler's, hardened into something unfamiliar, something sharp. "Grandma," she'd said, her voice laced with an exasperation that cut deeper than any overt cruelty. "Your stories are just, well, they're embarrassing. And that shawl? It smells like old lady, old lady." As if age itself were a contagion, a social disease one must shrink from. It happened at her engagement party, a glittering affair held in a ridiculously modern art gallery, all stark white walls and minimalist sculptures that looked like forgotten bits of scaffolding. Her fiancé, a young man named Julian, with an impeccably tailored suit and an equally impeccable air of detached amusement, had stood beside her, a faint smirk playing on his lips. They thought my silence then, the way I'd simply nodded and retreated to a shadowed corner, nursing a glass of watery punch, was a sign of my dotage, my acquiescence. They didn't see the careful construction of a wall around my shattered heart, the meticulous gathering of resolve. They didn't know that her words, embarrassing, old lady, would become the very ink with which I would pen a letter, a final testament that she, and perhaps they, would never, ever forget. It wasn't just about a shawl that smelled of lavender and thyme. It was about a lifetime of love and sacrifice being dismissed as an inconvenient, unfashionable scent. And I, Agnes Periwinkle, was about to ensure my true fragrance, my true worth, would linger long after their trendy minimalist world had faded. Now let me tell you what really happened. Olivia hadn't always been like this. Or perhaps the seeds of it were always there, and I, in my blind adoration, had refused to see them. I remembered her as a baby, all soft curls and gummy smiles, her tiny hand gripping my finger with a surprising strength. I was the one who walked her to her first day of kindergarten, her small backpack dwarfing her, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and excitement. I was the one who taught her to bake my famous ginger snap cookies, her little nose dusted with flour, her laughter echoing in my warm, sunlit kitchen. My daughter Sarah, Olivia's mother, was a gentle soul, perhaps too gentle, too easily swayed by the opinions of others, especially her rather overbearing husband, Robert. Robert, a man whose ambition often outstripped his empathy, had always viewed me with a polite, if somewhat dismissive tolerance. I was Sarah's mother, a necessary if somewhat anachronistic part of the family package. But Olivia, she had been my special girl. Or so I had believed. I poured my love into her. My time, my admittedly modest resources. When Sarah and Robert were struggling to make ends meet in their early years of marriage, it was my savings, carefully hoarded from years of part-time work at the local library after my own dear Arthur passed, that helped them with the down payment on their first small house. When Olivia showed a fleeting interest in ballet, it was I who painstakingly sewed her tutus, my old fingers surprisingly nimble with the delicate tulle. When she'd had her heart broken by her first teenage crush, it was my shoulder she'd cried on, my quiet words of comfort that had soothed her adolescent angst. I never asked for thanks. A grandmother's love, I believed, was unconditional, a boundless well from which she could always draw. The changes began subtly. Around the time Olivia went off to university, a prestigious, expensive institution Robert had insisted upon, she came back for holidays a little different. Her clothes were more sophisticated, her speech peppered with new, unfamiliar jargon, her gaze a little cooler, a little more appraising. She started to find my stories, the ones she used to beg for, a bit repetitive, Grandma. My home-baked treats were too rustic for her palate, accustomed now to artisanal macarons and gluten-free confections. The handmade shawls I knitted for her, once treasured, were now received with a polite but noticeably less enthusiastic, "Oh, thanks, Grandma," before disappearing into the back of her closet, likely never to be seen again. Sarah, my daughter, would offer apologetic smiles. "She's just growing up, Mom, finding her own way." Robert would merely grunt his approval of Olivia's newfound sophistication. I tried to understand. I told myself it was natural, this youthful shedding of the old, this embrace of the new. But a small persistent ache began to settle in my heart, a premonition of a widening gulf I seemed powerless to bridge. The engagement to Julian, a young man from a wealthy, socially prominent family, seemed to accelerate this transformation. Julian was everything Robert admired: ambitious, connected, impeccably dressed, with an air of effortless superiority. He treated me with a distant, almost clinical politeness, as if I were a slightly embarrassing antique his fiancée was unfortunately obliged to keep. Olivia, in his presence, seemed to amplify her own newfound worldliness, her laughter a little too bright, her pronouncements on art, fashion, and social trends a little too strident. My quiet, bookish granddaughter was being replaced by a glossy, brittle stranger I barely recognized. The engagement party was to be the grand unveiling of Olivia and Julian as a power couple, as Robert had so crassly put it. It was held not in a warm, welcoming home, but in a cavernous, achingly hip art gallery, all polished concrete floors and stark white walls, adorned with what looked to me like oversized, incomprehensible scribbles. The guest list, I soon realized, was a carefully curated collection of Julian's business associates, Olivia's new, equally glossy friends, and Robert and Sarah's more prestigious acquaintances. My own small circle of friends, the women I'd shared a lifetime of joys and sorrows with, were of course not invited. "It's a very specific vibe, Mom," Sarah had explained, her voice apologetic, her eyes avoiding mine. "You understand." I understood all too well. I was an anachronism, a relic from a past Olivia was keen to reinvent, or perhaps erase entirely. I chose my outfit with care: a simple, elegant navy dress, a string of pearls Arthur had given me, real pearls, not the ostentatious costume jewelry favored by some of the other guests. I even wore the shawl, a soft, hand-knitted cashmere in a muted heather shade, a gift from my own dear mother, a link to a lineage of quiet strength and enduring love. It did perhaps smell faintly of lavender and cedar, the scent of my linen closet, the scent of home. As I mingled, or rather attempted to mingle, I felt increasingly out of place, an awkward traditional footnote in their aggressively modern narrative. Olivia, radiant in a slinky silver dress that probably cost more than my monthly pension, flitted from group to group, her laughter a little too loud, her hand possessively on Julian's arm. She acknowledged me with a brief, distracted wave, her eyes already scanning the room for someone more important, more on-brand. It was later in the evening, as I was standing near a rather disturbing sculpture that looked like a melted bicycle, that the incident occurred. Olivia, Julian by her side, had approached a group of her new friends, impeccably dressed young women with identical, expressionless faces. I was close enough to overhear their conversation, though I clearly wasn't meant to be part of it. One of the young women, a blonde with an unfortunate amount of lip filler, gestured vaguely in my direction. "Is that your grandmother, Olivia? The one in the shawl?" Olivia's face tightened. She shot a quick, irritated glance my way, then turned back to her friends, her voice a low, confidential murmur, but perfectly audible to my suddenly acute ears. "Oh God, yes. That's Grandma Agnes. Honestly, she means well, but her stories are just, well, they're embarrassing. She goes on and on about the old days, and that shawl? It smells like old lady. I keep telling Mom she needs to update her wardrobe, but you know how stubborn they get." A ripple of condescending laughter went through the group. Julian, I noted, merely smirked, his gaze flicking towards me with a look of faint, disdainful amusement. Embarrassing. Old lady. The words, so casually delivered, so utterly dismissive, struck me with the force of a physical blow. My carefully constructed composure, the polite smile I had worn all evening like a shield, faltered. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck, my cheeks burning with a mixture of humiliation and a profound, bone-deep sorrow. It wasn't just the words themselves, though they were cruel enough. It was the casualness of the cruelty, the easy assumption that my feelings, my very presence, were of no consequence. It was the realization that my own granddaughter, the child I had loved so fiercely, so unconditionally, could speak of me with such disdain, such contempt, in front of her new fashionable friends. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the cold concrete floor. I wanted to rage, to scream, to demand an apology, but I did neither. I simply stood there, my heart a leaden weight in my chest, the scent of lavender and cedar, the scent of my mother's love, suddenly feeling like a mark of shame. I saw Sarah, my daughter, across the room, her face etched with a familiar anxiety as she watched Olivia hold court. She caught my eye, offered a weak, apologetic smile, then quickly looked away, unable or unwilling to intervene, to defend her own mother. That, perhaps, was the deepest cut of all, Sarah's silent complicity, her inability to stand up to her daughter's casual cruelty, to Robert's overbearing ambition. I retreated to a quiet corner, nursing my watery punch, the laughter and chatter of the party, a distant, meaningless roar. The minimalist sculptures seemed to mock me with their cold, impersonal modernity. The stark white walls felt like the sterile confines of a hospital room, a place where old, inconvenient things were sent to quietly fade away. But I was not ready to fade away. Not yet. Beneath the layers of hurt, of humiliation, a new emotion was beginning to stir, a cold, hard anger, a quiet, unyielding resolve. Olivia had called me embarrassing. She had dismissed my life, my love, my very essence, as an outdated inconvenience. She, and Julian, and perhaps even Robert and Sarah, thought they could simply edit me out of their perfect, curated lives. They were about to learn that some stories, some legacies, cannot be so easily erased. The scent of lavender and cedar, I decided then and there, would be a fragrance they would remember, one way or another, for a very long time. The drive home from that dreadful engagement party was a blur of unshed tears and a hardening resolve. The city lights, usually a comforting twinkle, seemed harsh and unforgiving, reflecting the cold knot of anger in my chest. Sarah, predictably, had offered a few mumbled apologies, a string of weak excuses for Olivia's behavior. "She didn't mean it, Mom. She's just stressed with the wedding planning, and Julian's family, they're a bit intimidating." I had merely nodded, my silence a more eloquent response than any words of reproach could have been. What was there to say? Olivia had meant it, every casual, cruel syllable, and Sarah, in her inability to defend me, had been complicit. The following days were a study in quiet contemplation. I moved through my small, familiar home, each object, each memory, imbued with a new poignancy. The rocking chair where I had sung Olivia to sleep, the worn copy of Goodnight Moon still tucked on the bookshelf, the faint, indelible marks on the kitchen doorframe where I had charted her childhood growth, each a testament to a love that now felt like a foolish, unreciprocated investment. The shawl, my mother's shawl, lay draped over the back of my armchair. I picked it up, its soft cashmere a comforting weight in my hands. It didn't smell like old lady. It smelled of history, of love, of generations of quiet strength, and I would not allow Olivia, or anyone else, to diminish its significance or mine. My mind turned, with increasing clarity, to my will. It was a simple document, drafted years ago by my dear Arthur, leaving everything, as was customary, to Sarah, with the understanding that she would in turn provide for Olivia. But now, that arrangement felt inadequate, unjust. To allow my life's savings, the fruits of Arthur's hard work, and my own careful stewardship, to eventually pass into the hands of a granddaughter who found me embarrassing, who dismissed my love as an inconvenience, felt like a betrayal of everything I held dear. I needed to do something. Not out of spite, though I confess a certain grim satisfaction at the thought of Olivia's eventual surprise, but out of a deep, abiding need to ensure my legacy reflected my true values, my true worth. I thought of Mildred, my oldest and dearest friend. Mildred, a retired headmistress with a mind as sharp as a tack and a tongue to match, had always been my staunchest ally, my most honest critic. She would understand. She would offer not judgment, but clear-eyed practical advice. I called her that afternoon. "Mildred," I began, after we'd exchanged the usual pleasantries, "I find myself in a rather perplexing situation. It concerns Olivia." Mildred, who had known Olivia since she was a baby, and who had, I suspected, long harbored her own reservations about Olivia's increasingly self-absorbed behavior, listened patiently as I recounted the sorry tale of the engagement party, of Olivia's cruel words, of Sarah's ineffectual response. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Mildred spoke, her voice devoid of its usual cheerful lilt, now imbued with a cold, hard anger that mirrored my own. "Agnes," she said, "that insolent little chit, after everything you've done for her, to be dismissed like that, so publicly, so cruelly, it's unconscionable." Her righteous indignation was a balm to my wounded spirit. "I know, Mildred," I said, "and I've been thinking about my will." "And so you should, my dear," Mildred said firmly. "Your will is your final testament, your last word, and it should speak your truth, not their expectations. What are you considering?" I took a deep breath. "I'm considering alternatives. I want my legacy to mean something, Mildred, to honor kindness, respect, genuine human connection, qualities that seem to be lacking in certain quarters. A most admirable sentiment, Agnes, Mildred said, a hint of her usual brisk cheerfulness returning to her voice. And do you have any particular alternatives in mind? I did. There was a small local charity, the Havenwood Project, that provided support and companionship for elderly individuals who were isolated or without family. I'd been quietly donating to them for years, ever since Arthur passed. They did wonderful work, bringing a little light, a little warmth, into lives that were often lived in the shadows. The thought of my home, my savings, benefiting such an organization, instead of funding Olivia and Julian's next extravagant vacation or minimalist art acquisition, filled me with a quiet, profound satisfaction. I'm thinking of Havenwood, Mildred, I said, leaving the bulk of my estate to them. An excellent choice, Agnes, Mildred said, her voice warm with approval, a legacy that truly reflects your generous spirit. Now, you'll need a good solicitor, someone who can draft this up properly, make it watertight. I know just the man. Alistair Finch, a bit of a dragon, but absolutely scrupulous. He'll make sure your wishes are carried out to the letter. And so, the plan was set in motion. An appointment was made with Mr. Finch. My resolve, once a flickering ember, was now a steady burning flame. Olivia had called me embarrassing. She had dismissed my life, my love, but she would not, I vowed, dismiss my legacy. It would be a legacy of kindness, of compassion, a final quiet testament to the values she had so carelessly, so cruelly, discarded. And the letter, the one she would never forget? That, too, was beginning to take shape in my mind, each word carefully chosen, each sentence a reflection of a mother's broken heart and a grandmother's unshakable resolve. The appointment with Mr. Alistair Finch was, as Mildred had predicted, an exercise in brisk, no-nonsense efficiency. His office was a study in old-world legal gravitas, dark wood paneling, shelves groaning under the weight of leather-bound legal tomes, a faint, reassuring scent of dust and beeswax. Mr. Finch himself was a man of indeterminate age, with piercing blue eyes, a shock of unruly white hair, and an air of quiet, unshakable authority. He listened to my story, my reasons for wishing to alter my will so drastically, without interruption, his expression unreadable. He asked a few pertinent questions, his inquiries sharp, insightful, designed to ascertain my mental competence and the sincerity of my intentions. I answered him clearly, calmly, my resolve unwavering. When I had finished, he leaned back in his large leather chair, his fingertips steepled. "Miss Periwinkle," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "it is of course your absolute right to dispose of your estate as you see fit, provided you are of sound mind, and not under any undue influence. Your wishes, as expressed in a legally executed will, are paramount." He paused, his gaze searching, "And I must say, from our conversation, I have no doubt as to your soundness of mind, nor do I detect any hint of external coercion. Your reasons, while undoubtedly painful for you, are cogent." His validation, so professionally, so dispassionately delivered, was strangely comforting. There was no judgment in his tone, no hint of surprise or disapproval, just a quiet acceptance of my right to choose. We spent the next hour discussing the specifics. The house, my beloved home, would go to the Havenwood Project, with the stipulation that it either be used as a residence for their clients, or sold, with the proceeds dedicated entirely to their programs. My savings, my modest investments, Arthur's pension benefits, all to Havenwood. I made only one small, almost symbolic bequest to Olivia. My mother's old battered recipe book, the one filled with handwritten notes and splattered with the evidence of countless baking sessions. The book Olivia had once, as a child, pored over with me, her small hands carefully tracing the faded ink. A reminder, I told Mr. Finch, of a time when simpler things, like a shared love of baking, held more value than social status or material possessions. Mr. Finch nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his piercing blue eyes. "A most eloquent gesture, Mrs. Periwinkle." The new will was drafted, reviewed and signed, with Mr. Finch and his equally formidable secretary, a stern-faced woman named Miss Grimshaw, as witnesses. The process was surprisingly devoid of emotional turmoil. It felt right, a quiet, definitive act of reclaiming my own narrative, my own legacy. Leaving Mr. Finch's office that afternoon, the crisp autumn air felt invigorating. A weight I hadn't even fully realized I was carrying had been lifted. My future, and the future of what I left behind, was now firmly, unequivocally aligned with my deepest values. The letter to Olivia, however, was a far more emotionally fraught endeavor. I spent many solitary evenings at my small writing desk, penning draft after draft, each attempt a painful excavation of years of love, sacrifice, and ultimately, profound disappointment. I didn't want it to be a letter of anger, of bitterness, though those emotions certainly simmered beneath the surface. I wanted it to be a letter of truth, my truth, a clear, unflinching account of how her actions, her words, her casual cruelty had impacted me. I wrote of my love for her, from the moment she was born, a tiny, perfect miracle in my arms. I wrote of the sacrifices made, not as a means of inducing guilt, but as a statement of fact, a testament to the depth of my maternal devotion. I wrote of the small incremental dismissals, the growing distance, the dawning painful realization that I was no longer a cherished part of her life, but an inconvenient, embarrassing relic of her past. And then, I wrote of the engagement party, of her words embarrassing, old lady, of the casual public cruelty that had finally irrevocably severed the last fragile threads of my maternal illusions. "You called me embarrassing, Olivia," I wrote, my hand trembling slightly as the words flowed onto the page. "You dismissed my life, my love, my very essence, as an outdated inconvenience. You, and your fiancé, and indeed your parents, seem to believe that I, and everything I represent, can be simply edited out of your perfect curated lives. You are mistaken. My life, my love, my legacy, they have worth, they have meaning, and they will not be defined by your shallow, self-serving judgments." I explained my decision regarding the will, not as a punishment, but as a consequence of her choices, of her disrespect, of her failure to value the bonds of family, of love, of simple human decency. "My estate," I concluded, "will now benefit those who embody the kindness, the compassion, the respect that you seem to have so carelessly discarded. The only tangible thing I leave to you, Olivia, is this letter, and my mother's recipe book. Perhaps, one day, when you are older, when life has perhaps taught you a few hard lessons about what truly matters, you will open that book, and in its faded, flower-dusted pages, you will find a reminder of a simpler, truer, and far more valuable inheritance, the unconditional love of a grandmother you chose to call embarrassing. A love you will then realize, perhaps too late, was anything but." I sealed the letter, along with the recipe book, in a sturdy manila envelope, addressed to Olivia in my neat, old-fashioned script. I instructed Mr. Finch to deliver it to her personally, along with a copy of the new will, only after my passing. There would be no dramatic confrontations, no tearful recriminations in my lifetime. My final word would be delivered quietly, posthumously, a silent, unanswerable testament to a grandmother's broken heart and her unshakable resolve. Life after the drafting of the new will, and the sealed letter settled into a new quiet rhythm, imbued with a subtle but profound sense of peace. The gnawing ache of Olivia's rejection, while still present, no longer held the same debilitating power. I had taken action. I had reclaimed my narrative. My legacy was secure, aligned with my deepest values. I found myself spending more time with Mildred, our friendship a comforting anchor in the often turbulent waters of my emotions. We'd take long, leisurely walks in the park, our conversation meandering from the trivial to the profound, our shared history a rich tapestry of understanding and affection. Mildred, with her sharp wit and her unwavering pragmatism, was a constant source of strength, her approval of my decisions, a quiet affirmation of my own courage. I also threw myself into volunteering at the Havenwood Project. It was a humbling, deeply rewarding experience. I'd spend a few afternoons a week there, helping in the small library, reading to residents whose eyesight was failing, or simply offering a listening ear to those who, like me, had experienced the loneliness of being forgotten, of being deemed an inconvenience by those they loved most. The stories I heard there were often heartbreaking, tales of neglect, of financial exploitation, of families torn apart by greed and indifference. But there were also stories of resilience, of quiet dignity, of small everyday acts of kindness that illuminated the darkness. It was a potent reminder that my own experience, while painful, was not unique, and that my decision to support Havenwood was not just a personal act of defiance, but a contribution to a larger vital cause. I saw little of Sarah or Robert. Their lives, it seemed, continued on their ambitious, self-absorbed trajectory. There were no further attempts at contact, no apologies, no acknowledgments. It was as if our family, the one Arthur and I had so lovingly built, had simply dissolved, leaving behind only the faint, bitter aftertaste of disappointment. Olivia, too, remained a distant, almost spectral figure. I'd occasionally see a glossy photo of her and Julian on some social acquaintance's online feed, at a charity gala, a trendy new restaurant, a polo match. They looked perfect, impeccably dressed, artfully posed, their smiles radiating a manufactured, almost unnerving contentment. There was no hint of any internal turmoil, any flicker of remorse or regret. It was as if the engagement party, my subsequent withdrawal, had been nothing more than a minor blip in their otherwise flawless ascent. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath that polished veneer, something was missing. A hollowness, perhaps, a lack of genuine warmth, of true connection. Or maybe I was just projecting my own biases, my own maternal grief. The sealed envelope, containing my letter and my mother's recipe book, sat in Mr. Finch's secure vault, a silent ticking clock, waiting for its appointed time. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I would reread the copy of the letter I had kept, my heart aching with a familiar mix of sorrow and a strange, steely satisfaction. It was a harsh letter, I knew, but it was an honest one, and honesty, I had come to believe, was a far greater act of love than any amount of polite, enabling silence. As the seasons turned, a year, then 2, passed. My health, never robust, began a slow, almost imperceptible decline. The old aches were a little sharper, the fatigue a little more profound. Mildred, bless her, was a constant fussing presence, ensuring I ate properly, took my medication, didn't overdo it at Havenwood. "You're not getting any younger, Agnes," she'd scold, her voice gruff but her eyes filled with an undeniable affection. "And we need you around to keep those Havenwood folks in line." I knew my time was likely drawing to a close. There was a strange, almost serene acceptance in that knowledge. My affairs were in order. My legacy was secure. My conscience was clear. I had lived my life as best I could, with integrity, with love, with a quiet, enduring strength. And if my final act was to deliver a hard but necessary truth to a granddaughter who had so grievously lost her way, then so be it. Perhaps, just perhaps, it would be the one lesson from her embarrassing old grandmother that she would never, ever forget. The letter, I hoped, would be more than just a recounting of past hurts. It would be a mirror, forcing Olivia to confront not just her cruelty to me, but the emptiness of a life built on such shallow, superficial foundations. And the recipe book, that was a legacy of a different kind, a reminder of warmth, of nourishment, of a love that was once as simple, as wholesome, as home-baked bread. Whether she would ever appreciate its true value, only time and her own heart would tell. The day came, as it does for us all, when my journey on this earth drew to a close. I passed peacefully in my sleep, in my own familiar bed, the scent of lavender and cedar from my mother's shawl, which Mildred had thoughtfully draped over my shoulders. A final, comforting fragrance. I imagined the scene in Mr. Finch's office, a week or so later, though, of course, I was not there to witness it. Sarah and Robert would have been summoned, their expressions a carefully calibrated mixture of feigned grief and ill-concealed anticipation. Olivia, perhaps, would have been there too, her youthful beauty undoubtedly marred by a flicker of something less composed, curiosity, anxiety, or perhaps just the same cool, appraising indifference she had displayed at her engagement party. Mr. Finch, in his solemn, gravelly voice, would have read the will, the initial clauses, bequeathing my few personal effects, my books to Mildred, a small piece of Arthur's mother's jewelry to Sarah, a token perhaps of a maternal love that had, despite everything, never entirely died, would have been unremarkable. And then, the bombshell, the bulk of my estate, the house, the savings, the investments, all designated, unequivocally, to the Havenwood project. I can almost picture the expressions. Robert's face, flushing a dull, angry red. Sarah's, a mask of bewildered disappointment, her eyes perhaps darting nervously towards her husband, then her daughter. And Olivia, who had so confidently dismissed me as an embarrassing irrelevance. Her reaction, I imagine, would have been a complex cocktail of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrified understanding that her grandmother, the old lady, whose stories she found so tiresome, had delivered a final, devastating, and entirely unexpected rebuke. There would have been protests, no doubt, questions, accusations. Mr. Finch, bless his imperturbable soul, would have handled them with his customary professional aplomb, pointing to the clarity of my signed witness declaration, the soundness of my mind at the time of its making. And then, he would have produced the sealed manila envelope. "There is one further item, Miss Periwinkle," he would have said, his piercing blue eyes fixed on Olivia, "a personal letter and an enclosure, which your grandmother specifically instructed me to deliver to you, and only to you at this time." I imagine Olivia's hand trembling slightly as she accepted the envelope. Perhaps she opened it there, in the oppressive silence of Mr. Finch's office, or perhaps she waited until she was in the privacy of her own minimalist, art gallery-like home. But open it, I know, she would. And as she read my words, my carefully chosen, painfully honest words, as she held my mother's old battered recipe book in her perfectly manicured hands, I truly hope, that something shifted within her. I hope she saw, finally, not just the grandmother she had dismissed, but the woman I had been, the love I had offered, the legacy of kindness and integrity I had tried, in my own imperfect way, to embody. I hope the scent of faded vanilla and old paper, rising from the pages of that recipe book, transported her back to a time when her heart was softer, her values simpler, her connection to me, and to a truer version of herself, still intact. Would it change her? Would it spark a flicker of genuine remorse, a dawning understanding of the profound, irreparable loss her own actions had precipitated? I cannot know. That part of the story is hers to write. But my story, my final chapter, was complete. My legacy was secure, not in the hands of those who had devalued me, but in the service of those who embodied the compassion and respect I held most dear. The Havenwood Project would flourish, offering comfort and companionship to other embarrassing old ladies who had been forgotten, dismissed, cast aside. And perhaps, just perhaps, my letter and my mother's recipe book would serve as a different kind of inheritance for Olivia, a more challenging, a more painful, but ultimately a far more valuable one. A reminder that true wealth is not measured in dollars and cents, or in social status, or in the fleeting approval of fashionable friends. It is measured in love, given and received, in kindness, in respect, in the simple, enduring fragrance of a life lived with integrity. A fragrance that, unlike the trendy perfumes Olivia so favored, would never, ever go out of style. And that, I believe, is a lesson she will indeed never forget. The aftermath of my passing, and the subsequent reading of my will, as Mildred later recounted to me in my imaginary conversations with her, a comforting habit I'd developed in my final months, was much as I'd anticipated, though perhaps with a few unexpected nuances. Robert, apparently, had been apoplectic, his initial disbelief quickly morphing into a sputtering rage. He'd blustered about contesting the will, accusing Mr. Finch of incompetence, even hinting at undue influence from the Havenwood Project itself, a charge so patently absurd it was almost comical. Sarah, my daughter, had been quieter, her reaction a mixture of shock, sorrow, and a dawning, uncomfortable guilt. She had, Mildred said, wept silently throughout Mr. Finch's reading, her gaze fixed on her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. Olivia, however, had been the most enigmatic. She had accepted the manila envelope from Mr. Finch with a stony, unreadable expression. She hadn't opened it there, in the oppressive atmosphere of the solicitor's office, but had clutched it to her chest, her knuckles white, and departed without a word to her parents. What transpired when she finally read my letter, when she held my mother's recipe book in her hands, I could only imagine. Did my words pierce through the layers of her carefully constructed sophistication? Did the faint, familiar scent of vanilla and old paper evoke any ghosts of a simpler, happier past? Did she, perhaps, finally understand the depth of the wound she had inflicted, the magnitude of the love she had so carelessly discarded? Mildred, ever the pragmatist, was skeptical. "Don't expect miracles, Agnes," she'd said, during one of our spectral tea parties. "That girl is her father's daughter, through and through, more concerned with appearances than with genuine feeling. She'll likely toss the recipe book in the bin and use your letter to light a fire under her next ambition." But I held on to a sliver of a different hope. Not for a dramatic, tearful repentance necessarily, but for a seed, a tiny seed of understanding, of self-reflection, planted in the barren soil of her self-absorption, a seed that might, just might, one day, unexpectedly bloom. The Havenwood Project, of course, was overjoyed and deeply grateful. My bequest, Mr. Finch informed me in my ongoing internal dialogues with him, he was a surprisingly good conversationalist for a solicitor, would allow them to expand their services significantly, to reach even more isolated and vulnerable seniors, to create a dedicated wing in my name, the Agnes Periwinkle Pavilion for companionship and care. The thought brought a quiet, profound satisfaction. My legacy would be one of warmth, of connection, of tangible support for those who, like me, had known the sting of being forgotten, of being deemed an inconvenience. It was a far cry from funding Olivia and Julian's next minimalist art acquisition, and for that I was eternally grateful. "Mildred, Bless her loyal heart became an unofficial guardian of my memory, a fierce defender of my final wishes. She'd visit Havenwood regularly, regaling the residents with stories of our youthful escapades, suitably edited for genteel company, of course, and ensuring that my contribution was being used wisely and well. She even, I like to imagine, baked a batch of my ginger snaps from a recipe she'd cajoled out of me years ago, sharing them with the Havenwood residents, a small, sweet taste of the love that had been so readily available and so thoroughly unappreciated in my own home. As for Olivia, the letter she'll never forget continued its silent work. Perhaps it lay in a drawer, unread, a painful reminder of a grandmother's disappointment. Or perhaps, just perhaps, she did read it, again and again, its words slowly, painstakingly, chipping away at the edifice of her carefully constructed indifference. Perhaps the scent of those old recipes, the ghost of my handwriting, would occasionally, unexpectedly, ambush her, a poignant reminder of a simpler, truer love she had so casually cast aside. I would never know. But I had spoken my truth. I had reclaimed my narrative, and my final act, my legacy, was a testament not to bitterness, but to the enduring power of kindness, of compassion, of a life lived with integrity, even in the face of profound personal hurt. And that, I believe, is a story, a fragrance, a lesson that transcends even the most embarrassing old lady and the most fashionable, dismissive granddaughter. The true impact of my letter and the accompanying recipe book on Olivia remained a mystery I would never definitively solve, yet whispers and anecdotal evidence, filtered through Mildred's surprisingly extensive social network, suggested that its effect was perhaps more profound than even I had dared to hope. It wasn't an immediate epiphany, no sudden tearful conversion on the road to Damascus, or in Olivia's case, on the road to the next trendy boutique. Instead, it was a slow burn, a gradual erosion of the carefully constructed facade she had presented to the world, and perhaps to herself. Mildred reported, with a certain grim satisfaction, that Olivia and Julian's engagement had, a few months after my passing, rather spectacularly imploded. Apparently, Julian, upon learning that Olivia's anticipated substantial inheritance had evaporated, had discovered that her vibe was no longer quite so appealing. His departure, Mildred relayed, had been as swift and unsentimental as his initial courtship. Olivia, stripped of her wealthy fiancé and her grandmother's anticipated financial cushion, found herself adrift in a world that was suddenly far less accommodating, far less impressed by her carefully curated sophistication. Robert and Sarah, consumed by their own thwarted ambitions and mutual recriminations, offered little in the way of comfort or support. Olivia was, for the first time in her privileged young life, truly on her own, forced to confront the consequences of her choices, the emptiness of a life built on such shallow foundations. It was some months later, perhaps even a year, that Mildred heard a rather curious piece of news from a cousin of a friend who happened to work at a small community-focused bakery in a slightly less fashionable part of the city. The bakery was known for its wholesome old-fashioned treats, ginger snaps, apple pies, lemon bars, the kind of comforting, unpretentious fare I had always loved, and which Olivia had so disdainfully dismissed, and who, according to this distant but apparently reliable source, was now working there, her once perfectly manicured hands dusted with flour, her expression a mixture of weariness and a new, unfamiliar humility. Olivia. My Olivia. Working in a bakery that smelled not of expensive French perfume, but of cinnamon, ginger, and warm, freshly baked bread. She was, apparently, learning the trade from the ground up, her former arrogance replaced by a quiet, almost desperate determination. And, the source had added, with a touch of bewilderment, she often brought in an old, battered, handwritten recipe book, its pages splattered and worn, from which she sometimes experimented, trying to recreate, with varying degrees of success, the simple, honest flavors of a bygone era. My mother's recipe book, my letter, had they after all found their mark? Had the scent of those old recipes, the weight of my final words, finally, irrevocably, pierced through the layers of her acquired indifference? I could only hope that in the kneading of dough, in the measuring of spices, in the comforting transformative alchemy of the oven, Olivia was not just learning to bake, but learning to connect with something truer, something more authentic, within herself, learning that true value lies not in fleeting social status or material possessions, but in the simple, enduring nourishment of the human spirit, learning that love, Real love, the kind her embarrassing old grandmother had offered so freely, so unconditionally, was a far more precious and far more lasting inheritance than any amount of money could ever buy. My legacy, I realized with a quiet, profound satisfaction that transcended even the grave, was not just in the Agnes Periwinkle Pavilion at Havenwood, or in the grateful smiles of the residents who found comfort there. It was also perhaps in the scent of warm ginger snaps drifting from a small, unassuming bakery, in the tentative, hopeful efforts of a granddaughter finally, painstakingly, trying to find her way back to a truth she had almost, but not quite, managed to forget. And that, I thought, was a story, a legacy, far richer, far more satisfying than any I could have ever initially envisioned. The letter had indeed been one she would never forget, not because of its anger, but because perhaps, just perhaps, it had finally, gently, irrevocably led her home. The final unexpected postscript to my story arrived, as these things often do, not with a bang, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible whisper. Mildred, ever my faithful correspondent in the great beyond, relayed it to me with a mixture of surprise and a grudging, almost reluctant, approval. It seemed that Olivia, after several years of working diligently at the small bakery, her initial, almost desperate foray into the world of honest labor, blossoming into a genuine passion, had done something rather remarkable. She had, with a small loan secured not from her parents, but against her own meager savings, and a surprisingly well-crafted business plan, bought the bakery. She had renamed it Agnes's Pantry. Its specialty? Old-fashioned, home-baked goods, made from recipes. Mildred was reliably informed, sourced from a certain battered handwritten cookbook. The bakery, apparently, was thriving, not in a flashy, ostentatious way, but with a quiet, steady success built on quality, authenticity, and a surprising amount of community goodwill. Olivia, Mildred reported, was different. The brittle sophistication was gone, replaced by a quiet competence, a warmth that seemed, for the first time, genuine. Her hands, once so perfectly manicured, were now dusted with flour, her smile less forced, her eyes holding a new depth, a new understanding. She rarely spoke of her past, Mildred's informant had noted, but when she did, it was with a quiet, reflective sadness, a sense of lessons learned the hard way. One day, a small framed photograph had appeared on the bakery counter, next to a jar of freshly baked ginger snaps. It was an old, slightly faded snapshot of a younger Olivia, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, her face alight with joy, her arms wrapped around the neck of an older woman with kind eyes and a loving smile, a woman in a heather-colored cashmere shawl that smelled no doubt of lavender and cedar. Me, her embarrassing old grandmother. Beneath the photograph, a small handwritten card simply read, "The original Agnes, the heart of every recipe." Mildred, when she recounted this to me, had to pause, her voice uncharacteristically thick with emotion. "Well, I'll be," she'd finally managed, a note of grudging admiration in her tone. "The little chit actually learned something. Your letter, Agnes, your blasted, eloquent letter, it seems it wasn't just one she'd never forget, it was one that actually changed her." And so my story, which had begun with such pain, such betrayal, found its unexpected, and rather sweet, denouement. My legacy, it turned out, was twofold. The Agnes Periwinkle Pavilion at Havenwood stood as a testament to my belief in compassion, in community, in the enduring worth of those society so often overlooks. And Agnes's Pantry, a small unassuming bakery filled with the scent of cinnamon and ginger, stood as a testament to the enduring, transformative power of love, of forgiveness, of a grandmother's final, heartfelt and ultimately unforgettable lesson. The letter and the recipe book had indeed found their mark. Not as instruments of punishment, but as catalysts for change, for growth, for a quiet, hard-won redemption. And somewhere, in the great loving mystery of it all, I smiled. My embarrassing old shawl, the scent of lavender and cedar, the stories of a bygone era, they had, it seemed, finally found their place, not in a minimalist art gallery, but in the warm, fragrant, beating heart of a granddaughter who had, at long last, truly come home,